In the harsh glare of an MTV spotlight, he shredded guitars and spat out anthems of disillusionment. Yet beneath the chaotic spectacle, Kurt Cobain yearned for a quiet, almost childlike innocence that the world of fame furiously denied him. He was the reluctant voice of a generation, a reluctant prophet of angst who found himself trapped by the very roar of the crowd he'd inadvertently ignited. He craved authenticity, but was consumed by artifice, a profound contradiction etched into every anguished lyric and every shy, averted gaze. Kurt Donald Cobain entered the world on February 20, 1967, in Aberdeen, Washington, a small, gray logging town shrouded in the perpetual dampness of the Pacific Northwest. His childhood was marked by a sensitive nature, a quiet imagination that sought refuge in art and music. His parents, Don and Wendy, were ordinary people living ordinary lives, but their world fractured when they divorced when Kurt was 9. This seismic event ripped through his young life, shattering any illusion of stability. The once outgoing, happy child retreated into himself, carrying the weight of a broken home like a physical burden. He bounced between relatives, never quite feeling settled, never quite belonging. This sense of displacement, of being an outsider looking in, would become a defining characteristic of his art and his life. Music became his solace, a secret language he could speak when words failed him. He found comfort in the raw energy of punk rock, the rebellious spirit of bands like the Melvins, who practiced in a house down the street. He taught himself guitar, often strumming along to whatever alienated sounds he could find, his fingers aching, his spirit finding a voice. The quiet dampness of Aberdeen, the pervasive sense of small-town stagnation, fed his growing discontent, fueling a longing for something more, something real, something that resonated with the turmoil simmering within him. He was drawn to the visceral, the ugly, the unvarnished truth, finding beauty in imperfection and a profound connection to the marginalized. Even then, as a shy, lanky teenager sketching band logos in his notebooks and scrawling lyrics on torn paper, the blueprint of his future was quietly taking shape, a desperate need to articulate the inchoate rage and sorrow he saw in the world and felt so deeply within himself. The sounds that poured from his cheap guitar and nascent voice weren't about fame. They were about survival, about carving out a space for himself in a world that often felt indifferent, or worse, actively hostile. The path from the dreary streets of Aberdeen to the global stage was a winding, often painful road paved with relentless perseverance and a deep-seated frustration. After high school, Kurt's life was a drifting existence. He worked menial jobs, got kicked out of his mother's house, and often slept on friends' couches or in cardboard boxes under bridges. This period of rootlessness, of observing the grim realities of poverty and apathy in his hometown, fueled his artistic vision with a potent sense of disillusionment. He bounced between various musical projects, searching for kindred spirits who shared his disdain for mainstream culture and his passion for raw, unpolished sound. He met Krist Novoselic, a towering, easygoing kindred spirit who played bass, and together they formed the core of what would become Nirvana. Drummers came and went, each departure a minor setback, but their shared vision held fast. They played in dingy bars, often to handfuls of indifferent patrons, the smell of stale beer and desperation clinging to the air. Their early gigs were chaotic, cathartic explosions of noise and angst, often ending with instruments smashed in a desperate attempt to communicate a feeling words couldn't capture. They poured out demo tapes, sending them to independent labels, hoping for a break, a chance to be heard beyond the confines of their isolated world. The rejections were frequent, disheartening, a constant reminder of the uphill battle they faced. The emotional toll was immense. Self-doubt was a familiar companion, whispering insidious questions about their worth, their chances. They lived hand to mouth, sacrificing comfort and stability for the elusive dream of making their music matter. Their sound was a deliberate rejection of the polished excess of 80s hair metal, a stripped-down, visceral return to punk's roots, infused with a melodic sensibility that was uniquely Kurt's. It was raw, honest, and painfully vulnerable. The signing with Sub Pop Records in 1989 felt like a monumental achievement, a validation of years of grinding obscurity. Their debut album, Bleach, was released to critical acclaim, gaining a loyal following within the indie rock scene. It was a modest success, but it was their success, earned through sweat, frustration, and an unwavering belief in their art. But the true breakthrough, the moment that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of their lives, came with the addition of Dave Grohl on drums. His explosive power and rhythmic precision completed the alchemy. The stage was set, not for a gentle ascent, but for a sudden, seismic eruption into the global consciousness, a shift that would bring them everything they thought they wanted, and much more than they could ever bear. The spotlight years for Kurt Cobain and Nirvana were a blinding, dizzying ascent into a fame he never truly desired, and a chaos he couldn't escape. The release of Smells Like Teen Spirit in 1991 was a sonic boom, an unexpected cultural earthquake that shattered the polished facade of 80s rock. The song, with its iconic riff and Kurt's guttural, defiant vocals, became an anthem for a disaffected generation, capturing a collective malaise no one had dared to articulate so rawly before. Suddenly, Nirvana wasn't just a band, they were a phenomenon. Never mind, the album sold millions, catapulting them from underground heroes to global superstars in what felt like a blink of an eye. They were everywhere: MTV, magazine covers, sold-out arenas across the world. The shift was jarring, disorienting. Kurt, the shy, introspective artist who despised corporate culture and mainstream aspirations, found himself the reluctant face of a massive commercial enterprise. The tours were a whirlwind of noise, exhaustion, and increasingly, alienation. The roar of the crowd, while initially exhilarating, quickly became overwhelming, a deafening wave of expectation. He'd often turn his back to the audience, a subtle act of rebellion against the adoration he felt unworthy of, or perhaps simply uncomfortable with. Backstage was a vortex of chaos: security, handlers, endless interviews, the constant demand for his attention, his thoughts, his very soul. The emotional high of applause was immense, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the quiet loneliness of a sterile hotel room, the emptiness amplified by the sheer scale of the day's adoration. He detested the idea of being a rock star, a hero, or a spokesperson. He wanted to make music to connect with people on an honest, raw level, but the machinery of fame twisted his intentions, commodifying his angst, turning his pain into a marketable product. He grappled publicly with the irony of their success, railing against the jock rock fans he felt were missing the point of his music, the very people who were now buying their records in droves. His lyrics, once a personal outpouring, were now dissected, misinterpreted, and packaged for mass consumption. The pressure to follow up Nevermind was immense, a crushing weight that intensified his already fragile mental state. His personal life, too, became a public spectacle. His relationship with Courtney Love, a volatile, passionate, and equally controversial artist, was a tabloid feeding frenzy. Their marriage, their shared battles with addiction, the birth of their daughter, Frances Bean, every intimate detail was splashed across headlines, turning their private struggles into public entertainment. He wrestled with chronic stomach pain, a debilitating physical ailment that added another layer of agony to his existence. Heroin, initially sought as a way to self-medicate his physical pain, became a desperate escape from the suffocating reality of his life, a numbing oblivion from the overwhelming roar of the spotlight and the quiet, gnawing emptiness within. The greater their fame, the more profound his isolation became, a poignant balance between public glory and a devastating private cost. The internal collapse of Kurt Cobain was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a tragic descent into the very darkness he had so eloquently articulated in his songs. As Nirvana's star continued to rise, so too did the intensity of Kurt's struggles with heroin addiction. What may have started as a desperate attempt to alleviate his debilitating stomach pain, a physical agony doctors struggled to diagnose, quickly spiraled into a powerful dependency. The drug offered a brief, terrifying escape from the relentless pressures of fame, the constant scrutiny, and the profound discomfort he felt in his own skin. He hated the celebrity, the misinterpretation of his lyrics, the legions of fans he felt misunderstood his message. Heroin offered a quiet oblivion, a temporary silencing of the internal noise. His relationship with Courtney Love, his wife and the mother of his daughter, Frances Bean, was a maelstrom of intense love and equally intense chaos. Their shared addiction often fueled their volatility, leading to public spats, dramatic reconciliations, and a pervasive sense of instability. The media, vultures circling, devoured every detail, turning their private battles into sensational headlines, further isolating them from a world that seemed determined to exploit their misery. The birth of Frances Bean in 1992 brought moments of profound joy, a glimpse of the domestic bliss Kurt truly yearned for. He adored his daughter, and she became a fragile anchor in his turbulent existence. Yet even this profound love couldn't always pull him back from the precipice. His mental health deteriorated. Depression, a long-standing companion, deepened, exacerbated by addiction and the crushing weight of expectation. He felt like a fraud, a puppet, forced to perform a role he despised. He struggled with feelings of inadequacy, a deep-seated insecurity that no amount of adoration could ever truly dispel. The lyrics to songs like Lithium and Come As You Are now seemed eerily prescient, raw confessions of his inner turmoil. He tried to get clean, entering rehab multiple times, but the grip of addiction was fierce, and the underlying pain that fueled it remained untreated. Friends and bandmates watched helplessly as he slipped further away, his once vibrant spirit dimming. His voice, once a defiant roar, often became a whisper, his communications increasingly erratic. "I'm a manic depressive. I hate myself," he reportedly confided to a friend, laying bare the profound self-loathing that festered beneath the surface of his public image. The final months were a desperate dance between attempts at recovery and devastating relapses, a man caught in the inescapable grip of his own demons, longing for peace that felt impossibly out of reach. The turning point, a chillingly public unraveling that foreshadowed the end, occurred during Nirvana's 1994 European tour. Kurt's struggles had become increasingly apparent, his performances erratic, his health visibly deteriorating. The physical pain, the relentless addiction, and the profound mental anguish were consuming him. In early March, after a show in Munich, Germany, which he cut short due to illness, Kurt's despair reached a critical point. He flew to Rome, where he joined Courtney Love, who was also there. On March 4, 1994, in a devastating moment that sent shockwaves through his inner circle, Kurt overdosed on champagne and Rohypnol, falling into a coma. It was a clear and terrifying suicide attempt, a desperate cry for help disguised as an accident. While he eventually recovered physically, the emotional scars were profound. This collapse on foreign soil, far from the watchful eyes of most of his bandmates and closest friends, was a stark, undeniable manifestation of the depth of his internal crisis. It was the moment his private battle unequivocally spilled into a public, terrifying display. Back in Seattle, after the Rome incident, an intervention was staged by his friends, family, and bandmates. They confronted him, pleading with him to seek help, to choose life. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed to have an impact. He agreed to enter rehab, but the grip of his addiction and depression was too strong, the escape too tempting. He checked into the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles on March 30th, 1994, a last-ditch effort to save himself. Yet, within days, he had scaled a wall and fled, disappearing into the vast anonymity of Los Angeles, a ghost among millions. This quiet decision to step away from the chance at recovery, to choose to vanish, reshaped his future with chilling finality. It was no longer about battling fame or mental illness on stage. It was about a desperate, silent flight from himself, from the expectations, from the very notion of a structured life. His absence sparked a frantic search, a desperate race against time by those who loved him. This turning point was not a dramatic comeback, but a quiet, tragic departure from the possibility of one a final, despairing surrender to the forces that had hounded him for so long. The brief, haunting period, often described as Kurt Cobain's life after fame, was, in truth, a desperate and tragic flight from it. After escaping rehab in Los Angeles, he didn't fade quietly into obscurity or reinvent himself in some peaceful, anonymous corner of the world. Instead, he retreated into a profound, almost catatonic silence, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control over a life that had spiraled wildly out of his grasp. He returned to Seattle, becoming a phantom in his own city, his movements erratic and elusive. He avoided his family and most of his friends, cutting himself off from the very people who desperately wanted to help him. The silence after the spotlight was not one of healing or quiet reflection. It was a deafening void, filled only by the echoes of his own internal torment. The man who had railed against consumerism and hypocrisy found himself trapped by the very machine he despised, unable to escape the celebrity, unable to shed the persona. He was no longer touring, no longer recording with the same urgency, yet the paparazzi still lurked, the speculation still swirled, and the weight of being Kurt Cobain remained an unbearable burden. He spent his final days largely in isolation, his addiction deepening, his depression spiraling into an abyss. He was seen occasionally, a gaunt, ghostly figure, unrecognizable to many who had once adored his vibrant stage presence. His humanity during this period was painfully exposed, a lost soul struggling against an invisible enemy, desperately seeking an end to his suffering. There were fleeting moments of attempted connection, a phone call to a friend, a brief interaction with a loved one, but these were overshadowed by his increasing withdrawal. He coped with the silence not through finding peace, but through the numbing embrace of drugs, seeking oblivion from the relentless noise of his own mind and the impossible expectations of the world. His home, a place that should have offered sanctuary, became a cage, a final solitary refuge where he could hide from the relentless gaze of a world that both adored and suffocated him. This wasn't a reinvention. It was a slow, agonizing disengagement, a final, quiet surrender. Kurt Cobain's voice still echoes today, a raw, piercing cry that resonates with new generations, feeling the same sense of alienation and discontent. What he gave the world was more than just grunge music. He gave a voice to the voiceless, a soundtrack to disillusionment, and a profound validation for anyone who felt like an outsider. He tore down the walls of rock star artifice, revealing the messy, vulnerable, and often ugly truth beneath. He showed us the beauty in imperfection, the power in anger, and the aching honesty in admitting one's pain. He challenged norms, inspired rebellion, and left an indelible mark on culture that transcends music alone. But what the world took from him was his peace, his privacy, and ultimately, his life. It took the shy boy from Aberdeen and thrust him onto a global stage he never asked for, turning his personal torment into public spectacle. It demanded an authenticity he couldn't sustain and a leadership he never wanted. The roar of the crowd, ironically, became a cage. His premature death on April 5, 1994, at the age of 27, was a tragic punctuation mark to a life lived on the fringes, a devastating loss that left a gaping wound in the heart of music and culture. Yet even in his absence, his spirit endures. His worn-out cardigan, his battered guitar, his scribbled lyrics, they remain powerful artifacts of a soul laid bare. And in the silence after the final, mournful strum of his acoustic guitar on MTV Unplugged, we are left with the haunting image of an empty microphone stand, illuminated by a single fading spotlight, forever waiting for the reluctant prophet to return, his voice a whisper, his legacy a thunder.